The earth lay cracked and pale beneath a late afternoon Sunday dust, rolled across the main street of the small prairie town, lifting in restless eddies that clung to skirts and boots alike. The air was so dry it seemed to scrape the inside of her throat. She stood on the rough-hewn boards of the auction platform, head bowed, bonnet slipping low to shield her face. Her hands trembled inside worn gloves, fingers twisting a handkerchief so thin it threatened to tear. The crowd shifted below men with hats pulled low, women with folded arms, children clinging to mothers' skirts. Their eyes passed over her with the blunt detachment of people weighing cattle or measuring fence posts. She had not eaten in 2 days, but her hunger was not what burned. It was shame, raw and heavy, pressing her chest against her ribs. The auctioneer's voice rang out, sharp as a whip crack. His words cut through the wind like iron nails. "What'll you give for the widow? $4, gentlemen. $4 for strong hands and a willing heart." His laugh was hollow, practiced, a sound stripped of kindness. Murmurs rippled across the crowd. A cough, a chuckle, the scuff of boots. She felt the weight of every gaze, each one stripping away another thread of dignity until she feared she would vanish entirely. Her knees trembled, but she held herself upright. If she bent now, if she fell, they would remember her only as a body broken before the bidding even began. The first offer came from a man in a coal-dust coat, his eyes sharp, his mouth twisted. He lifted his hand without looking at her, as though tossing a coin to a beggar. She bit her tongue against the rising taste of bile. Another voice followed, rough and disinterested, as if he were buying firewood to see out the winter. Each number rose slow, measured, spoken with the heavy weight of currency, in a land where money carried more promise than prayer. The sun lowered itself inch by inch, painting her shadow long across the boards, thin as a stretched cord. She closed her eyes and felt her own heart like a trapped bird against her ribs. The bids slowed. The crowd began to murmur with impatience, their voices a restless tide. $4. That was all her life seemed worth, $4 exchanged like smoke in the wind. She thought of the grave still raw in the prairie earth, her husband's name carved shallow in wood. She thought of nights where loneliness swallowed whole hours, where the silence of the plains pressed in until she felt smaller than a grain of dust. A life reduced to coin, a name lost in dust. She tried to swallow the sob clawing up her throat, but the taste of despair was sharp as iron. Then, as the auctioneer drew breath to close, a voice broke through the murmur. It was not loud but steady, low enough to hush the restless tide of the crowd. She did not at first see who spoke, only felt the silence settle like a blanket. Boots stepped forward, measured and slow. A man moved through the parting bodies, the brim of his hat casting shadow over his face. His shoulders bore the weight of labor, his hands dark with soil, his coat mended but clean. He did not shout his claim. He leaned close enough that only she heard. The words breathed like a vow, like something meant for no one else. "You're mine forever." The crowd stirred, uneasy at the quiet possession in his tone, as if they had witnessed something binding not of law but of spirit. She lifted her eyes for the first time, catching the faint lines carved into his face by years of wind and Sunday. His gaze was not hungry, nor mocking. It held a kind of gravity, steady as the earth itself. For the first time in many months, her knees stopped trembling. Something deep inside her, buried beneath layers of loss and fear, flickered with the fragile warmth of recognition. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it. The auctioneer cleared his throat, muttered about closing, but the man did not move, his hand resting firm at his side, his presence enough to end the bidding. She stood there, chest tight, air caught in her lungs. $4 hung in the silence, a sum almost laughable, and yet behind those words, "mine forever," was something no coin could measure. The crowd broke apart in murmurs, boots scuffing, voices fading. Dust swirled again across the emptying street, settling on her shoulders like the hand of fate itself. She breathed once, deep and steady, and the world did not collapse. Instead, it shifted, ever so slightly, toward a future she could not yet name. He did not touch her when the auction ended. He only stepped to the edge of the platform and waited until she gathered the strength to climb down. His shadow fell beside hers, long and even. The crowd thinned like water retreating from rock, leaving behind the grit and the smell of trampled dust. Somewhere a door slammed. Somewhere a horse blew through its nose. The handkerchief in her fist had torn without her noticing. She folded the torn edge into her palm as if it were a secret. The man slid a tin cup across a rail. "Water," he said, the single word quiet and ordinary, as if they were two travelers sharing shade. She lifted it, the metal cool against the ache in her fingers, and drank in small, careful swallows that did not betray how the emptiness inside her yawned. He did not look away while she drank. His stillness felt like a kind of shelter. She remembered the last time she had held water that was not stolen from a trough at night. A kitchen kettle, a blue enamel rim knocked and chipped, wind pushing against a window that refused to seal. Her husband's cough behind her, buried in a pillow to hide it from himself. Then the winter that stretched on like a punishment, and a fever that turned his breath into a thin whistle that kept time with her prayers. She had buried him under a cottonwood whose roots reached into water he could no longer drink. The ground had not given easily. Her palms blistered through the borrowed gloves, and no neighbor came with a spade. After that came the letters demanding a debt she did not owe. The men who arrived with ledgers and shook their heads at the same time, the slow stripping of what little remained until all that was left was her. In the end, even her name felt pawned. The man gestured toward a wagon where the paint had worn to the grain. A square of canvas threw shade like a single cloud. She stepped up onto the plank, careful of the laces that had given and been wreck-knotted, careful of the way the world tilted when she moved too fast. He waited while she settled on a folded blanket laid over sacks of seed. It smelled of linen dried in sun, clean and warm. He tied the lead rope with knots that were sure, but not hurried. When he climbed up, he left a space between them wide enough to breathe. They traveled at the pace of a prayer spoken by someone who does not expect an answer but says it anyway. The road wove between fields that bore stubble bleached by light. Grasshoppers clicked like dry beads. Her fingers fumbled at her lap, searching for the letter she had kept, even when she had sold the better shawl. It was no longer there. She felt the panic flare and ebb. The letter had said nothing now. It had once promised help from a cousin in a town that had turned out to be farther than her feet could carry. She had used it as proof that she belonged to someone. Without it, she belonged to the wind. She drew her hands together, palms warm, and willed them still. He spoke again only when the town had settled behind them as a smudge. "There is stew at home," he said, "and bread cooled on a rack." She did not thank him. Gratitude could open a flood that would drown them both. Instead, she watched his hands on the reins. The knuckles were cracked and browned. A white line of an old scar crossed one thumb like a riverbed in drought. Those hands could build a fence and hold a child and bury a wife. She did not know if any of these had been his tasks, but the hands said yes. Clouds gathered to the west, slow and deliberate. A hawk pulled a circle against them and narrowed its gaze to the moving ground. The wagon rocked, and a jar under the bench clinked against the wood. He slid it toward her. Inside sloshed milk the color of winter mornings. She shook her head. He left it between them as if he were saving a space for her answer. After a time, her throat cooled enough to accept a swallow. The milk steadied the earth. A band of riders passed at a distance, the men who had bid with lazy cruelty. They watched without stopping, hats low, faces tuned to the language of ownership. She felt the old shame reach for her like a rope. He did not turn his head toward them, and that refusal cut the rope clean. A breath she had been holding since the platform sighed out of her without sound. When the road bent toward a stand of willows, he slowed the team and stepped down to walk. He led the horses through the shade as if ushering them into a church. She watched the way his shoulders eased under the trees. He touched a branch, not to break it, only to feel it. It occurred to her that a man who honored small living things might not take what was not freely given. The thought startled her. It made a little light inside that did not hurt. "So," he said after a long while, the word shaped as a question and not a demand. "You have a name you prefer." She said it, the sound thin from disuse. He nodded, repeating it once, careful on the syllables, as if setting a fragile cup on a shelf. The wagon creaked forward again. She felt the word settle on the air between them, whole for the first time in months. belonging to her and not to a ledger. Past the willows, the land opened into late light. Far off, a house assembled itself from distance roofline first, then walls squared against the horizon, a corral like the frame of a picture that still waited for its image. She did not know what waited in that house. She knew only the taste of stew named aloud and the way his voice had said forever, as if he had meant the work that sounded like. She lifted her hand, palm flat against the rough weave of the blanket, and pressed down, testing the strength of the board beneath. It held. The house stood plain against the wide horizon, boards grayed by weather, roof patched with tin that caught the last orange streaks of Sunday. No fence kept the prairie back. Grass leaned against the porch, as if it had grown tired of standing. A dog raised its head from the shade of the steps, ears pricked, eyes wary, then settled again with a thump of tail. She watched all this, with the caution of someone expecting the picture to shift into something cruel. Yet nothing shifted. The house stayed still, the kind of stillness that comes from years of holding ground against storm. He stopped the wagon before the steps and tied the reins to a post scarred with old rope marks. His movements carried the rhythm of habit, each knot and pull done without thought. She sat unmoving, hands pressed into her lap, until he reached for the jar of milk and set it on the porch rail. He did not offer his hand to her. He only waited, a patience that felt heavier than any command. At last she climbed down, skirts brushing dust, knees stiff from holding so much silence. Inside the air was warmer, touched with the smell of iron from the stove, and thyme hung to dry by the window. A loaf rested on a cloth, crust split, a pot low on the grate, sending up the quiet promise of stew. She stood near the doorway, shoulders taut, like a deer at the edge of water. He crossed to the stove, lifted the lid, stirred with a wooden spoon. "Sit," he said, not sharp, not coaxing, just the word. She obeyed because the chair was there and because her legs trembled. The bowl placed before her, steamed with carrots and beef, thickened broth the color of earth after rain. Her fingers shook when she lifted the spoon. The first taste burned her tongue, but she held it, unwilling to let go. She chewed slow, breath caught. The second spoonful brought tears, though she bent her head so none would show. He ate across from her, steady, unhurried. Between them the dog settled at her feet, head against her shoe as if he had chosen. When the bowl was empty, she touched the rim with her finger, tracing the crack that ran across like a fault line. Memories seeped through the steam. A kitchen once filled with laughter that dimmed too quickly. A hand at her back, gentle when life still held softness. A winter night when the wood ran out, and she fed the fire her best shawl while he coughed into the dark. The ache returned, raw and endless, but the stew steadied her enough to bear it. The crack in the bowl did not break beneath her hand. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the last light bled away, he lit a lantern that swung faint shadows across the walls. He showed her the room at the back, where a bed weighted with quilts faded from years of Sunday. She stood on the threshold, unsure if stepping inside was surrender. He must have seen the fear in her eyes. He rested his hand against the doorframe, palm flat, leaving space between them wide as a canyon. "Rest," he said, and nothing more. Then he turned and left her alone. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers digging into the quilt. Moonlight leaked through a crack in the shutter, painting her knees pale. She removed her bonnet and set it on the chest by the wall. Her hair spilled loose, heavy, tangled with dust. She pressed her face into her hands, trying to quiet the storm of memory. The platform, the voices, the laughter still sharp as thorns. She told herself this was no worse than all that had come before, but something inside whispered that it was different. That whisper frightened her more than cruelty ever had. Outside, boards creaked under his weight. She heard the sound of boots crossing the porch, the scrape of a chair pulled out. He would keep watch, she thought. Against whom or what she could not name. Yet the thought held enough to let her ease back onto the quilt. For the first time in many nights she closed her eyes without dread pressing against them. She slept with the dog curled at the foot of her bed, a warm weight against the hollow of loneliness. Dreams came, the grave under the cottonwood, the earth that had resisted her hands, the men whose eyes had cut her open with indifference. But between those dreams came another fields unbroken, a child's laughter rising like wind, A voice steady as stone, whispering your mine forever, not as possession but as vow. She woke with tears drying on her cheeks, and the faint gray of dawn at the window. The dog stretched and yawned. The house breathed around her, wood settling, stove ticking as it cooled. She touched the quilt, whispering her own name to herself, hearing it sound whole. Morning came thin and pale, light slipping across the floorboards like spilled milk. The quilt held her warmth, but the air was sharp, scented with wood smoke, and something green from the fields beyond. She sat up slowly, her body stiff, her throat tight with the weight of remembering where she was. The bonnet weighted on the chest, its ribbon frayed. She lifted it and then set it down again. For once, she did not need to hide behind its shadow. From the other room came the scrape of a chair, the muted clatter of tin. She pushed the door open and found him at the table, sleeves rolled, bread sliced thick beside a crock of honey. He looked up, eyes steady, not surprised to see her. He gestured toward the chair opposite. She crossed the room with steps careful as though each one tested the floor's strength. The dog padded behind and curled by the stove, sighing like an old friend. The bread was warm still, the crust breaking under her fingers. She ate in silence, every bite pulling her back to a time before hunger had gnawed her hollow. He poured coffee into a chipped enamel cup, sliding it toward her without a word. She drank slow, letting the bitterness fill the cracks shame had carved. Outside, a rooster called into the wind, defiant and thin, a sound that belonged to no one but the morning. She studied him when she thought he would not notice. His face was carved by years under sun, lines etched deep around eyes that had learned both patience and loss. He spoke little, but his silence carried no threat. It was the silence of a man who had stood long in fields waiting for rain, who had buried something once and walked back home anyway. She wondered what name lay under the earth for him, what grief had pressed him into the shape he now bore. When breakfast was done, he stood and reached for his hat. "Fence is broke along the south," he said, voice even. "Need fixing." Then he looked at her, not with command but with invitation. "You care to walk?" She hesitated, then nodded. Better the open fields than the four walls where memory cornered her. The land opened around them, prairie stretching like an endless hymn. Wind combed the grass into long waves that broke against the hills. Her skirts caught burrs, her shoes filled with dust, but she did not falter. He carried tools slung across his shoulder, wood and wire rattling against his coat. They walked in silence, yet each step side by side pulled the distance tighter between them. A hawk wheeled above, its cry a thin blade across the sky. At the fence line, he set down his tools and showed her how to hold the post steady while he hammered. The blows rang out, clean and strong, echoing across the field. Her palms burned with the strain, but she gritted her teeth and did not let go. Sweat beaded on her temple, hair sticking to her face, yet she felt a strange pride rising. She had thought herself too broken for labor, too small for the wide world's demands. Yet here she was, shoulder to wood, standing firm. When the post sank into earth, solid and unyielding, she nearly smiled. He straightened and glanced at her, eyes narrowing against the Sunday. A faint nod passed between them, acknowledgement without flourish. They worked until her arms ached, until the fence stretched again like a line of prayer stitched across the land. She sank to the ground, breathing hard, dust on her hands and knees. He lowered himself beside her, pulling off his hat to wipe his brow. They sat in silence, the kind that spoke more than words, the kind that said she was no longer invisible. As the wind cooled, he reached into his coat and drew out a small tin, dented but clean. Inside lay jerky wrapped in cloth. He handed her a piece, his fingers brushing hers just enough to spark a shiver. She chewed slow, the salt sharp against her tongue. He chewed too, gazing out at the line of fence now mended, his jaw working with quiet resolve. Her eyes stung. She thought of the platform, of the $4 tossed like scraps. Here, in the wide fields, under the honest sky, she felt more than a sum. Her body was sore, her pride raw, but she was still upright, still breathing. She wiped her hands on her skirt and pressed her palm against the earth, feeling the steadiness of it beneath her. For the first time in months, she wanted to live, not just survive. The days folded one into another, stitched by labor and the rhythm of weather. She rose with the light, her body slow to wake but steadier than before, and found him already outside, shoulders bent to work. She learned the weight of buckets drawn from the well, the sharp bite of cold water splashing over wrists, the smell of hay sweet and sharp when it was turned in the loft. Her hands hardened, blisters thickening into calluses, until she could hold the hoe without flinching. The work ached, yet in the ache she found proof that she still belonged to the world. At night they sat on the porch, chairs tilted back, the dogs stretched at their feet. The lantern burned low between them, moths batting against its glass. He rarely spoke more than a few words, but in the pauses she began to hear more. The quiet weight of thought, the unspoken memory of loss. Once she asked, voice almost lost in the dark, "Was there someone before?" His silence lasted long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "There was, nothing more." She did not press. His grief deserved its own space, just as hers did. The silence after felt like respect, not absence. When storms rolled in from the west, thunder pacing slow and heavy, she helped him drive the cattle to shelter. Rain struck hard enough to sting, but she kept close, skirts plastered to her legs, hair dark against her face. He glanced once, as if measuring whether she would falter, and when she did not, something in his expression softened. They stood dripping in the barn afterward, breath clouding the air, and for a moment the storm outside seemed small compared to the pulse of warmth between them. She began to notice the details of him, how his hand lingered over the neck of a horse, how he paused before cutting a sapling as if asking permission, how he touched the brim of his hat whenever he passed the graveyard on the ridge. There was a gentleness hidden beneath the broad frame, a reverence she had not expected. It was not the gentleness of weakness, but of someone who had learned what could break and chose to carry it carefully. Her own heart wrestled against itself. Trust felt dangerous, a rope she feared would tighten if she grasped it. Yet without warning she found herself laughing one evening when the dog tumbled after a rabbit and returned empty-mouthed, ears low. The sound startled her as much as him. He turned his head, eyes catching hers in the last light, and though he said nothing, the corner of his mouth bent upward just enough to mark the moment. It was the first time she felt herself seen as more than a widow, more than a sum owed. Still, doubt lingered. When she walked into town for supplies, she heard the whispers, the quick drawl of men who remembered the auction, the women who tilted their heads with pity too sharp to bear. She kept her chin level, but their voices followed, gnawing. That night she sat long at the table, staring at her hands, wondering if she had merely traded one form of shame for another. He caught her gaze, steady, waiting. "You're not theirs," he said. 3 words, simple, certain. She wanted to believe, though part of her still trembled. One evening, under a sky flushed with dusk, he opened the door to the barn and beckoned her inside. Against the wall stood a cradle, rough-hewn but polished smooth, its wood dark with oil. "My father made it," he said. His hand brushed the rail, reverent. "It held me. Then my brother's son, been empty too long." The words carried both ache and hope. She felt her breath falter. He was showing her not just wood, but the weight of heritage, of dreams still alive beneath grief. She touched the cradle, fingers trembling, and felt her own heart crack open wider than fear. From that night, something shifted. Their work together no longer felt like survival, but like weaving. Each chore bound them closer, her voice humming low as she kneaded bread, his hands steadying hers when she misstepped in the furrow, the two of them standing side by side while the sun bled red across the land. The vow whispered at the auction grew roots here, in soil and sweat, in small gestures that asked nothing and gave everything. She began to carry her name with less shame, to speak it with the steadiness of someone who might one day teach it to another. Autumn pressed itself across the land, slow and heavy, painting the cottonwoods gold and scattering their leaves in brittle drifts. The air sharpened, carrying the scent of frost, and nights came earlier, stars burning colder above the fields. She wrapped herself in a shawl patched thin, standing at the porch rail while he finished the day's work. The lantern on the post drew a small circle of light against the dark, and within that circle his figure moved steady as always. each motion deliberate, as if measured against the silence of the plains. Life had begun to braid itself into routine, yet the quiet thread of unease still ran through her. In town she heard rumors of a claim against her, whispers that the auction had not cleared her debts. The men who had bid for her still watched with eyes that calculated rather than cared. One evening, as she left the mercantile with a sack of flour balanced in her arms, a hand brushed her sleeve too deliberately. $4 wasn't near enough, the man muttered, voice thick with malice. She kept walking, spine rigid, but his laughter followed her to the wagon. Shame burned her cheeks, hotter than the sun overhead. For the rest of the ride home, she said nothing, clutching the flour as if it were her last defense. That night, as she kneaded bread, her hands struck harder than needed, pounding the dough as though it were the man's face. He came in from the barn, boots leaving prints of dust across the floor, and paused when he saw her. He did not ask what troubled her. He only stepped close and laid a palm flat on the table, steadying it as if anchoring her anger. She froze, then let out a breath that shook. "They won't let me forget," she whispered. His jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath the skin. "Then we won't let them decide," he said. The words struck like an iron promise, and she clung to them through the night. But the pressure grew. Weeks later, a man arrived at the house with papers in hand, lines of ink that declared she still owed what could not be paid. He smirked when he delivered them, tipping his hat toward her with false courtesy. She felt herself fold inward, the shame returning sharp and raw. The rancher took the paper, read it slow, then tore it in two. The man spat in the dirt and rode off, his parting words heavy with threat. She trembled, not from fear alone, but from the weight of being the cause of trouble brought to his door. That evening they sat in silence, fire crackling low, shadows shifting along the walls. She could not meet his eyes. "I should leave," she said finally, voice brittle, "before they take more from you." His chair scraped as he rose. She flinched, bracing for anger. Instead, he crossed to her and crouched low, bringing his face level with hers. "Do you think I paid $4 for a debt?" he asked. She shook her head, unable to answer. "I paid because I saw you standing when most would have fallen. That's worth more than any land, more than coin, and I won't see you sold twice." His hand touched hers then, warm, rough, steady. She let her fingers fold into his, the weight of fear loosening just enough to breathe. Still, the threat did not vanish. Riders lingered near the ridge some nights, their silhouettes cut against the moon. Whispers traveled faster than wind. She felt the edge of doubt again, wondering if she had chained him to her misfortune, if love born of auction could withstand the cruelty of men who measured everything by ownership. He sensed her distance, though he did not name it. One morning, after fixing the corral, he said, "A fence don't hold forever. You've got to walk it, mend it, claim it each time it breaks. Same with trust." She held his gaze, the truth of it too plain to deny. The choice loomed clear: to retreat into shame and leave before the debt consumed them both, or to stay and face it at his side. The decision cut her heart raw, but as she watched him bend to lift a child's abandoned toy, he had carved a small horse left by the cradle she knew. Some things were worth mending again and again. Winter crept in with a quiet cruelty. The wind scraped the walls at night, carrying the sound of coyotes yipping at the edges of the fields. Frost feathered the windows each dawn, white veins climbing the glass. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she worked, breath blooming into pale clouds, fingers stiff with cold. Still, she did not falter. Each chore completed was a vow renewed to the land, to herself, to the life she was building beside him. He chopped wood in the yard, his axe splitting logs with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the bones of the house. She stood at the doorway watching, steam rising from the stew pot behind her, and felt something stir in her chest. Strength lived in his arms, yes, but also in the way he stacked each log neatly, in the patience of his movements, in the order he brought to the world's harsh edges. She thought of the men who had bid for her as if she were cattle, and the contrast made her throat tighten. He had claimed her with words that sounded like possession, yet his every action since had given her back to herself. But the shadow of debt had not lifted. Rumors wound through town, whispers of men planning to contest the auction, to strip the ranch from under him and cast her out once more. She felt the weight of it pressing heavier with each passing day. One evening, as snow began to fall, soft and relentless, he found her sitting at the table with her face in her hands. "Tell me," he said, his voice low, more invitation than demand. She lifted her eyes, raw with unshed tears. "They'll take everything. Because of me." He set his hand flat on the table, fingers spread wide. "Then let them try." His eyes burned steady, not with anger, but with the certainty of a man who had survived loss before. "This land's been tested by worse than men with papers, and so have you." His words cut through her despair, but still she wavered, torn between belief and fear. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 riders appeared at dusk, their horses blowing steam into the frozen air. They dismounted at the yard, boots crunching through snow, and one of them called out her name, voice thick with derision. She froze, every muscle straining. He stepped forward before she could, placing himself between her and the men. The leader spat into the snow. "She's not yours to keep. Papers say otherwise." The rancher's hand rested at his side, not near the rifle leaning by the post, but steady enough to make the point. "You think words on a page weigh more than what's been built with these hands?" he asked. His voice did not rise, but it carried, cutting through the cold. The men shifted uneasily, the silence between his words heavier than any threat. Finally, with muttered curses, they mounted again and rode off into the gathering dark. She stood trembling, breath ragged in the frigid air. He turned then, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, and searched her eyes. "You're not alone," he said simply. She felt the truth of it like heat against the cold, filling the hollow places inside her. That night, as snow piled against the door and the fire snapped in the hearth, she lay awake in the small room he had given her. The cradle still stood in the corner, empty but waiting. She rose quietly, crossing to it, running her fingers along the smooth rail. The memory of the auction, of voices measuring her worth in dollars, no longer crushed her as it once had. She was more than what they had called her. More than the debt, more than the shame, and though she feared the future, she knew she had chosen it. At dawn she stepped outside, shawl wrapped tight, and watched him harness the horses. Snow gleamed across the fields, unbroken, stretching endless as a promise. She moved toward him, her feet crunching through the white, and when he looked up, she found her voice steady. "I'll stand with you, whatever comes." The words hung in the cold air, fragile and fierce. His eyes softened, the lines at their corners deepening, as if to hold them. He reached out then, just enough for her hand to rest in his. Their breath mingled, rising in small clouds that vanished into the pale sky. But the vow remained. Together they turned toward the horizon, where the land waited to be sown again.